They moved the data down so oh, so if we can first move
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking today about outcomes and how we can assess our patients' needs and the type of benefits that they hopefully will obtain from our rehabilitation efforts. If you remember back when you were reading the article that was looking at the effectiveness of group oral rehab, what was one of the biggest criticisms of some of the studies that were reviewed, or collectively what was an issue that made it hard? There was no consistency or minimal consistency in the outcome measures that were used. Some of them didn't have any, some of them used one type of measure, others used something else. And so it was this lack of consistency. And part of that is just simply a function of the fact that we really do have so many different ways of assessing our patients and their needs and their benefits. That's a double-edged sword. It's great because we can really isolate out specific aspects of their lifestyle or look at specific parameters of their benefit. But at the same time, because there are so many different measures or things that we can measure, hard to find a whole lot of uniformity. You're not going to find 100 studies that just looked at one particular aspect and all used the same measure. But some of the things that we need to look at when we're assessing the person's needs or their handicap, we may be interested in their social adjustment. We may be looking at emotional adjustment. We may be looking at occupational or vocational issues. We may be looking at just their overall adjustment to amplification to the hearing aids and assistive devices. We might want information about their lifestyle and their specific communication needs, or we might just want to look at an overall quality of life measure. So there's lots of different things that we can measure. Some of the assessments kind of look at everything. Others are very focused, and so you kind of have to decide what information is going to be most important for you and for your patients. And then I would say of the things that we're going to look at today, I would try and find one or two that you think, ooh, I think I could really use that. Stick with it. Yes.
I'm assuming this is done like after they have used their hearing aids for a couple.
Well, you're typically going to give them an assessment baseline to see where they're having trouble, because sometimes we use that information to even help us select what type of hearing aid, and we'll go over if there's a lifestyle matrix. There are several, but I included two to show you today so you can kind of figure it out. Because let's say we have a patient who's leading a very active lifestyle, young, still working, in noise and quiet, in meetings, has very demanding, is involved in lots of recreational activities, has a very demanding lifestyle, and yet, so it would, logic would dictate that we want to get them into a premium, advanced type of technology, digital amplification, and yet they may only want to spend what it would cost to get them into something very basic, very entry level. Okay, we've immediately got a disconnect between what their lifestyle and communication needs are and what they're willing to spend. And so that's when we then have to start discussing, reasonable expectations. There's nothing to prevent you from getting this particular hearing aid that costs this amount, but you need to understand it's not going to provide you with the benefit in these situations. Is that, and if it's a cost benefit that they're willing to accept, then it's fine, but a lot of times it's not. So then we have to negotiate, okay, well, what would you be willing to sacrifice, and then we can go from there. But so it often is done after, but we typically have to do something as a baseline at the beginning as well, so that we know where did we get to.
So this is outline of something you've been before you say have hearing aids.
Yeah, and we'll go over some of those. Because remember, we've talked about before, hearing loss does not just create a situation where certain sounds are difficult to hear. There is the risk of isolation because they're not able to participate in groups and activities that they once did. There's a high risk of miscommunication and therefore embarrassment for them. So they just start isolating. There's guilt that can be involved if they're no longer able to fulfill certain roles or obligations. There's often shame, there's stigma attached. I'm not sure why people are ashamed to admit that they have a hearing problem. They're not ashamed to admit when they have a vision problem or, addiction problems or whatever it might be. People are often going to share way too much information about way too many things, and yet hearing loss is, it's sort of like, my mom is from a generation that if the topic is just too much, whisper it. Did you hear about Aunt Betty? She has cancer. well, it's like whispering it minimizes the effect. And I've not seen this as a universal thing. I've seen it in women of my mom's generation. I mean, it's like if they're somewhere between, say, the age of 60 and 80, certain subjects are just taboo or just too much to deal with, so they try and minimize the impact by whispering it. And it's the same thing. And my aunt said, yeah, I had to go to the doctor last week. Really? What kind did you get? I'm like, okay, let's talk about it. So there's a lot of shame attached to it. The rate of depression in folks who have hearing loss, particularly untreated hearing loss, is significantly higher. Measures of stress have indicated and suggest that people with hearing loss, particularly untreated hearing loss, have much higher incidences of stress. And we also know, particularly in older adults, hearing loss and particularly untreated hearing loss results in a loss of independence. Because usually, when they have untreated hearing loss, they're misunderstanding things, they're forgetting things. Well, no, they didn't hear it to begin with. You can't forget something that you didn't hear. But then their family starts getting concerned that Nana's getting a little mushy in the head, so they start, coddling her or putting restrictions on her that are maybe unnecessary. So there are implications far beyond just the inability to hear. And we need to take those factors into consideration. And you need to decide which, if any of those things beyond just hearing, you want to address as part of your rehabilitation program. In terms of occupational and vocational, sometimes they may be able to go back to their career with some adaptations or accommodations. But in some cases, it may require vocational change. I use the example of air traffic controllers. They are not allowed to have hearing loss and continue to work, regardless of whether they have amplification or not. Believe it or not, commercial truck drivers have limits on the amount of hearing loss that they're allowed to have and legally retain their commercial driver's license. And they can use amplification, but there are specific criteria in terms of how bad the aided loss can be at specific frequencies. So, in some cases, a person may have to undergo a vocational or occupational change. And that's something that we sometimes are involved with. Folks with untreated hearing loss, on average, earn $15,000 less per year than their peers who have treated hearing loss doing the same job. Okay? But even with treated hearing loss, they tend to be about $7,000 less per year than their normal hearing peers doing the same job. So if you have 3 people doing the same job, one has normal hearing, one has hearing loss, but it's treated, and one has untreated hearing loss, you're going to probably see 3 different pay scales for them. It's discrimination. It's illegal, but it happens. There are a lot of things that are illegal. It still happens. It's illegal to drive over the speed limit. I can guarantee you probably every person in this room is a criminal because you've done it. So it doesn't make it right. But you need to understand. Hearing loss, especially untreated hearing loss, can dramatically limit a person's vocational options, whether real or imagined. Because sometimes folks will just assume that they can't participate or pursue a particular vocational path because they have hearing loss or some other impairment, and that may or may not be the truth. So, anyway. So when we're looking at, if we want to use adjustment as a criteria for measuring outcome, we're going to have to do some sort of a baseline at the very beginning before we implement amplification, before we implement rehabilitation. Then we're going to have to set some goals. It's very, very important at this point to talk about realistic expectations. I just had this discussion with my grad students in our motor speech class last night. You're dealing with a person who has a motor speech problem. It's usually not realistic to expect an outcome of perfectly articulated speech. What do we want? Functional communication. My second years know this, they're living it. And if we set them up with the expectation that they're going to have perfectly articulated speech, we're going to have very disappointed and, if not pissed off, patients. Because there's a disconnect between what's realistic and what they're expecting. And so we have to, I would say, under-promise and over-deliver. And they're happy and they think that you're a miracle worker. And that's good for your self-esteem. And having clinicians with good self-esteem then makes it better for the next patient. So in any case, we have to set those realistic expectations. I gave the example of the guy who has hearing loss. We're in the process of determining what kind of amplification and assistive devices he might need. And we really want the whole 9 yards for him. We want, premium level technology. We want a remote microphone. We want a neck loop with Bluetooth capabilities so that he can use his phone, his iPod, his iPad, all connected, television through his hearing aids. And he wants to spend, $1,500 tops. Okay, well, that's going to get you a very basic hearing aid that I would probably only recommend for the little old lady who lives in her apartment, talks to her cat, and watches The Price is Right in the middle of the afternoon, and that's about the extent of her communication needs. Then that would be fun. Not for the guy who is, a sales rep who's on the road, in his car, in conference calls, in meetings, in restaurants, working with potential leads and clients day in and day out. So we have to set those realistic expectations. Then we have to set some target goals in conjunction with our selection of the amplification, and then we have to decide what rehab strategies are going to be needed. After we have implemented all of that and we have done whatever rehabilitation we're going to do, then we're going to look at their post-fitting outcome, and then we may give them some sort of a satisfaction measure. So, baseline, goal setting, intervention, post-treatment, and then satisfaction. Several steps. So, many of the manufacturers help us determine what type of amplification we should recommend for the person. And what's really nifty is they typically customize it to their particular hearing aids, so that most of the hearing aid manufacturers have their own lifestyle guide. And they used to ask a lot of questions that were very similar to one of the tools that we're going to look at, the HHIA and the HHIE, which is the hearing handicap index for adults and for the elderly. And that was wordy and it took a long time. Patients didn't like to do it. So they got smart. And they made it totally pictures. And so they showed pictures of different communication situations, and the patient had to pick and they grouped them together, and they had to pick, okay, well, which lifestyle is closest to yours? And then depending on what they picked, then there was a recommended hearing aid solution for them. But Resound, Unitron, and Phonak, Siemens, and Oticon, and these are the big players. These are really the big four hearing aid manufacturers. Starkey would be the fifth. All have them, and I actually have Starkey's in with. I updated some slides, so if you go to the resources and you check out the slides, it will say revised. So for Starkey, you've got a person who is just in a quiet environment, quiet conversation, maybe watching TV, outdoors. Here they're in a restaurant, there they're in a meeting. So as the situation gets increasingly more difficult, then the level of technology that the person needs is going to become more and more sophisticated. So if you're mostly one-on-one, relatively quiet things, then they're saying, oh, you can use our Series 70. It's our entry level. If you're getting into more group situations, more difficult listening situations, oh, you need our Series 90. And if you're one of those people that you go to sporting events and you have a really active lifestyle, you need the most sophisticated. And this one is one from Unitron and Phonak, and it's the same way. So if you're TV, telephone, just casual conversations, you can do that. But if you want to add in things like going to restaurants, maybe meetings, things like that, then you're going to need something more active. And then again, so all the person has to do, you give it to them and say, look at these pictures. Which one describes your lifestyle? They point to it and say, okay, well, this is what you need. So it makes it really handy, and it's a lot quicker than them having to fill out a bunch of questions. Now, I was hoping, but for whatever reason, it's not connecting. There's also an app from Unitron. Some of you participated in our hearing screening study. Well, part of that app, there's also a really quick, I think, 10-minute questionnaire where all they have to do is they read the statement, have you noticed that you don't hear as well as you used to? Always, occasionally, never. And so there's a series of questions. It'll take them maybe a minute to answer them all, and it's a always, sometimes, or never. And when you're done, depending on your answers, it gives a number score, and it tells whether or not it appears that you have hearing loss. Well, for us, as professionals, we actually have a handy-dandy guide that we can refer to, so that depending on what that number is, we also have an idea as to what we might want to recommend if we do confirm the hearing loss, because then we know lifestyle-wise how it is impacting them. So there's more than one way to get the information you might want. But what I want you to see is rather than doing something lengthy and drawn out, at least for the selection process, you can use pictures. And the nice thing is you're giving it to them. You're telling them, tell me what your lifestyle is like. You're not making any assumptions. But then it's really hard for them to argue when you say, okay, well then you need this level of technology. Because the one that you give them doesn't typically have the stuff on it. They just get the one with pictures, and then you flip it over and say, okay, you said this is you. Well, this is what you need. Maybe a little devious, but it does the trick. When you're assessing patients, there are two types of measures you can use. There are those that are open-ended, and that allows them to choose their own goals, identify their own areas of need, or there are ones that are closed-ended. Probably the most commonly used and popular of the open-ended measures is the COSI. And an advantage is, in using an open-ended instrument, is that it allows the patient to select what are their concerns, what are their goals. Okay? So you really get an individualized and customized measure. Then there are others that are basically closed-ended, closed systems where they're given a choice and they select things. An advantage to those is that it's sometimes easier because patients may not really, they often don't know what they don't know. So they may have a hard time coming up with goals. The disadvantage is that sometimes the person might have a very specific need that's not addressed as one of the choices. And some examples that we'll go over, the AFAB, the Hannah, and the Saddle. We'll talk about those a little bit more today. So, know that you have choices.
And what exactly are they measuring?
That's a very good question. And that's one of the problems is they are frequently measuring very different things. And we'll look at, I think it'll become more apparent when we look at some of the examples. The HHIE, which is the Hearing Handicap Inventory for the elderly, it is 25 questionnaires, 25 questions, and they basically answer yes, no, or sometimes. There's also a screening version, so let's take a look at that. Gotta find it. Here it is. Okay. All right. So the HHIE, it says it'll give them a series of questions. Does the hearing problem cause you to use the phone less often? Does it cause you to feel embarrassed when meeting new people? Does it cause you to avoid groups? So basically, it's looking at, and if you notice, there's little letters. These are social, is S. E are emotional. And so it's looking at the social and emotional impact of the hearing loss on this person. And then at the end, they get a score. And then, so this would be your baseline. So they answer these questions. And then you provide them their amplification. You provide them with any kind of rehabilitation. Maybe you're going to have them attend, a group oral rehab program for 4 sessions. Maybe you're going to give them the LACE program. They're going to listen and complete that. Once that's done, then you have them fill this out again, and you look for change in their scores. Okay? Does that make sense? So the HHIE is primarily a social and emotional measure. All right. The HHIA is almost identical, except that it's modified for adults that are not elderly. So there are a few questions that are slightly different in terms of wording. But again, the HHIE and the HHIA are social, emotional factors. So if that's really what you want to measure, those are great tools. If that's not your primary concern, you don't want to use those. Okay? The Glasgow hearing aid benefit profile, and then there is the AVAB, which is the abbreviated profile of hearing aid benefit, are two assessments that really focus on what kind of benefit is the person getting from amplification. The Glasgow has, I forget, it's an astronomical number of questions. It has 14 different listening situations, and they rate how often each of those situations is relevant to them, how often would they find themselves there, and then they use a 6-point scale to describe how they do in those situations. And you get information about their baseline disability, how handicapping it is to them, how often they're reporting that they're using their hearing aids, how they perceive the hearing aids are benefiting them, their overall satisfaction, and a residual disability. You get a lot of information. However, people lie, intentionally or unintentionally. One of my favorites is, and now we have ways, since 1998 when this came out, we have ways of actually getting some of that information, but we don't have to rely on them. So for example, Mr. Jones comes in and he says, Doc, I am just not happy with how the hearing aids are working. I'm not really finding that they're giving them much benefit. Oh, well, how often are you wearing them, Mr. Jones? Oh, I am wearing them every day. Let's see, you came in on March 1st, so it's April 4th. You've had a month to use those. Let's hook them up and make sure they're working okay. So you hook them up, and then you look at the data log, and it shows that in that time period, he's had 14 hours of hearing aid use. Well, you jackwagon, you've used them a half an hour a day on average. You're not using them. If you're using them every day, you're wearing them a half an hour at a time, and that ain't enough time. I would say that to the teacher. I would say, well, you know, looking at the hours of use information here, I'm wondering if you're really giving them good enough try. So we have other ways, rather than having them fill out, this form is intimidating for me, and I have a doctoral degree. I don't like to fill it out. I mean, it's a nightmare. So they came up with an agreement, but there are people who really, especially at the hearing aid manufacturers, if they have people participating in their rollout of new products, they frequently will still use this because they want all the information they can get. Plus, people are typically, when they're doing that, they know they're going to get free hearing aids out of it, so they're a little bit more willing to fill out a lengthy questionnaire. The AFAB, still 3 pages long, but it's only 24 questions. Oh, it was 66 on the first one. And it only has them rated in 2 conditions, with and without their hearing aids. So at baseline, obviously, it's without only. And at the end, we have them fill it out using. So again, they have a Likert scale that ranges from always to never, and you compare the aided and unaided scores. So it's a lot simpler. So people like that. And we have the AFAB here somewhere. So the AFAB, it'll have them, they're basically honing in on the stuff that is in italics, and they're using this scale as to whether it's always, almost always, on, down to never. So it looks at things like talking outdoors, in a crowded space, in a lecture, at the dinner table, in traffic. And again, you compare with and without. So if you really want to see what's going on in terms of the impact of amplification, AFAB is actually a very good measure to use. Okay, the HANA is the hearing aid needs assessment. This is a really good one to use. It's sort of a lifestyle questionnaire, and it allows you to kind of figure out, again, like some of the picture ones did earlier, what level of technology they need, and then you can use it later on to see how well the hearing aids are meeting their needs. Okay. The saddle is the satisfaction with amplification in daily life, and it looks at satisfaction versus benefit. And the two are different. Benefit is there a difference with and without? Satisfaction is, are you happy with that difference or not? So if you're looking at wanting to gauge their overall satisfaction, this is a good measure to use. And this one is used a lot following our rehab programs because it takes into consideration factors other than just the hearing aids. So, I mean, hearing aids are certainly a part of that process for most of our patients, but anyway, it's a good measure if you wanted something that's going to kind of give satisfaction rating. Very similar to the measure that was used in that Jacksonville program where they had most people scored at a 5 or a 6 on a 6-point scale. They were using something similar to this. Okay? Then this is a really good one. If you really want to look at the impact of hearing loss on their communication, the problem is it is extremely long. It's 145 items. It was developed at the VA, obviously, because they have a captive audience, and basically you're being held hostage. If you want hearing aids, if you want oral rehab, you will fill out all of our paperwork. And veterans and their families are used to lots of paperwork and lots of red tape for anything. So they can get by with it. But it does look at the emphasis is on communication success and personal adjustment. So people to do it, or if they would please, God, please come up with an abbreviated version. My cousin is an Army audiologist, and she tells me working on an abbreviated version because that's her main complaint. If you could get someone to complete this whole thing twice, you're going to have great information. The problem is it's just not realistic. So hopefully they will come up with a condensed or screening version of it that has fewer questions. I'd like to see it have 20 questions or less. And hopefully then we'll be able to give them 5 questions in each area. And use it. So anyway, it's a very useful tool. It's just not practical. The SOAK and the SAC, so it's a significant other assessment of communication, and the SAC, the but it's the person's assessment of their communication, are really good if you're wanting to look, again, at communication skills. One of them, the patient fills it out, the SOAP is filled out by a significant other. That's often important information because the significant other may have a very different assessment of the person's communication skills. It's nice because it's only 10 items, so it's quick and easy to fill out. And I've got it somewhere here. So here it is. Okay, so it's a significant other's assessment of communication. It's a 5-point scale, almost never or never to practically always or always. And then it looks at different communication situations, communication contexts. So again, these are ones that are very beneficial, particularly for you guys that are going to be speech pathologists, because you can really hone in. It really doesn't matter if the person has amplification or not. You're looking at how well are they doing. And I like to have, if I'm going to use this, I like to have this filled out like at the initial appointment, before we do anything other than maybe the hearing test, and then I'll have them fill it out again after they've had a fitting to see how they're doing when we get that first checkup, and then after we've done any rehabilitation, fill it out at final time so that we kind of have a nice moving picture. And there's nothing to prevent you from doing it again for an annual checkup, periodically off in the future, so that you can really get information about long-term outcome. And honestly, I like a tool that's going to get feedback from a significant other or primary communication partner, because I think that they tend to be a little bit more objective. Not always, but I think you're increasing your chances of getting accurate information if you're relying on someone other than just the patient. But there is a patient version as well, so you can. Okay. So again, you can use these to get pre and post scores. The COSI, which is the client-oriented scale of improvement, as I said, those were all closed-ended. This is an open-ended assessment. It's been around since '97, so it's been around for a long time. And the person identifies up to, it doesn't have to be, but they identify up to 5 specific situations or goals that they want to improve. So it could be, I want to be able to understand my wife when we're driving in the car and carrying on a conversation. I want to be able to hear the television at a loudness level that's comfortable for the rest of my family. I mean, it can be very individualized, very personal, okay? And that is the advantage, is that it's completely personal. And you get a relative score and an absolute score. The relative score is how much better they're doing compared to before, and the absolute score is how good is it. So maybe their how well are they doing isn't as good as you would like, but it's a hell of a lot better than it was where they started. And that, I think, is good because it allows you to possibly modify, adapt, or provide different or additional rehab services. Maybe it helps you identify the need for a remote microphone. Maybe it helps you identify the need for a TV listening solution. It's good information and it's specific to that patient. And okay, so this is an example of the COSI for children. And I want to load this up. Yes. Oh, it's not good. Is that going to give me the option to zoom?
I think you could, there's like a percentage bar, you could barely say
Oh.
exposure.
Thank you. There we go. So they set a goal. You have a target date and the strategies that you're going to use, and then you can rate it as no change, small change, significant change, or goal achieved. Okay? So again, this is the one for children. Okay? And then we have one for adults. Okay, and this one is a little bit more detailed in that it actually has percentages. So it makes it a little bit more specific. But again, you have your different goals. And what's really kind of cool is it allows them to rank order them. So you can say, you know, I have these 5 goals. And this is my number one most important one, because that can really help. And they give some examples so that if the person is having a hard time, it gives them some suggestions to help foster, you know, possibilities for them. So I really like the COSI. Several of the hearing aid manufacturers have now actually included it with their fitting software, so that it's kind of there in your face and reminds you, ooh, maybe you would want to do this. Because it's one of those things where it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, but if it's there, all you have to do is hit a little icon. It might motivate you to use it a little bit more often. Anyway, again, a potential drawback is that you have all of these different measures. And so I think it becomes pretty easy to see that when it comes to evaluating the efficacy of oral rehab, we're going to have some trouble because the good thing is we have lots of options. The bad thing is we have lots of options. And so I think sometimes it's better if you're searching for efficacy information that you include search parameters like, you know, social, emotional, or hearing aid benefit, so that then, you know, when they do a review like was done in that study, that they can narrow it to just comparing studies that were looking at similar things. Problem is you're going to find even fewer, because I think they started out with, I forget how many, and they ended up with only 12 or 13 that they actually looked at. Well, if we then took those 12 or 13 and only looked at ones that we knew were really measuring similar things, you know, we'd have even fewer. So it can limit us. I think I'd rather have a small number of studies that are comparative and looking at similar things, so we can really identify trends, and a bunch of gobbledygook. Another method, and it's one that audiologists will use, are functional gain measures and real ear measures. What's functional gain? What do you think that is?
Like, once they have the hearing aids, they're able to do one.
Exactly. So we do a hearing test on them to determine how bad it is. So we have an audiogram. Well then, after we provide them with their hearing aids, we put them in the sound booth, and we give them a hearing test again. And look at where are they hearing now? And their functional gain is the amount of improvement that we were able to achieve. Okay? So it allows the patient to know we've moved your hearing loss from this range to this range. Sounds great in theory. And at a minimum, people should be doing this. That's the minimum. Because it is still very subjective, depending on even slight variations in how the seating arrangement and the speakers are aligned, you can actually get some pretty dramatic shifts that may or may not be accurate. And also in the real world, people are not going to be sitting or standing necessarily at 0, 90, and 180 azimuth from them. So there are a lot of people who say it's really kind of a test of nothing because it's not real world. But I do think that you can get some information. For example, if you did speech and noise with them as part of their hearing test and they scored 46%, and you do speech and noise with them with their hearing aids on and they've improved to 84%, that's an impressive improvement. And the circumstances are the same and they're similar to real life. So anyway, so functional gain is just basically an audiometric measure comparing how they did before versus after. Real ear is where you actually put a probe down in their ear with the hearing aids in, and you actually measure how much sound is being delivered to the ear so that acoustical properties, everyone's ears are slightly different in the shape, the size, the depth of our ear canal. That's all going to change how much boost we get. And so we could theoretically think that we're putting in 30 dB of gain in this person's ear, but based on how their ear canal is shaped and configured, we might actually be providing 38 dB, or we might be providing 19 for all we know. So unless we actually measure what's going on in that ear, we really don't know for sure. So it's a much more objective measure. So for functional gain, these red dots would be what the hearing thresholds were like on the audiogram. Then we fit them with hearing aids, and this is what we get. So we can see that we've got 5 dB of gain here, we've got 10 dB of gain here, we've got 20 dB of here, we've got 20 dB here, and we've got 25 dB there. So we've taken this loss from being down in the moderate range to at worst in the mild range. So that's a nice improvement, at least theoretically. This is more often what you end up with. So this is what the hearing was like. These white dots are what you're hoping to get so that you can move them all within the mild or normal range. And the yellow dots are more often what you see is that you don't get nearly as much amplification in those higher pitches as you would like. And the reason being is ear canal acoustics. It's going to shape, dampen some sounds, boost some others, and so what you think you're putting in the ear based on you guys have seen us all working on the computer and we're making adjustments and everything. Well, that's theoretically what's happening. What may actually be happening down in the ear could be very different. And so that's why we have to do RealIR measures. So this shows them inserting the probe mic. This is what the setup actually looks like. You can see the probe tube going down in the ear, and then we can get what's called a speech map. So this is the maximum output. This is what their hearing thresholds are like. And then we have some varying speech maps where, depending on the loudness of the speech signal going in, we're looking at where it's going. This line right here that's coming through, that's basically their comfort zone. And so we can see even with soft signals and with loud signals, we're doing well. The problem is with loud signals, we're actually violating their comfort zone because we don't really want to go above that line. So this tells us, ooh, we're over amplifying them. We're giving them more than they need. So then we can actually go in on those handy dandy little adjustments that you see us make, and we can actually go in and put real numbers in there so that we're really hitting their target. More often than not, you don't see over amplification. What you see is gross under amplification. And so then we end up having to put in more of a boost. Some manufacturers, though, their targets are really good. I love Unitron and Phonak because their targets are, when I've done comparison of just using their standard first bit to RealIR, they're greater than 80% accurate, which is pretty doggone good. And RealIR takes a lot of extra time, and it's extra effort, and it's not something that we can bill for separately, at least not to insurance. We can bill the patient for it, but most of them don't want to pay for it. And so I typically will hold off doing RealIR until their first follow-up appointment. And if everything's hunky-dory, I don't bother. If they're having issues, then I will typically do RealIR at that point to see, hey, why are we getting this complaint? A lot of colleagues that don't do it at all. I have a lot of colleagues who say you're doing it backwards. If you did it at the front end, you wouldn't have to worry about it later, but to each his own. But anyway, it's much more objective. So the bottom line, we want to assess the hearing pattern. We need to consider their lifestyle and communication needs. We want to look at their overall benefit because that's going to give us information about whether or not additional services are needed. Are we ready for discharge? Do we need to make modifications? And more, as we're pushing to have rehab paid for by insurance companies, they're wanting outcome measures. And if we don't have data and information to show that what we're doing is making a difference, they're not going to pay. Like, there's no way I would share with them the results of that article that you guys reviewed. Because what are they going to glom onto? The fact that over the long term, people who didn't go through rehab are doing as well as the people who did. My reaction to that is, yeah, but these people got there a lot sooner, so they've had much longer time where they've been able to hear well than the folks who didn't, but that may be a hollow argument. So you want to make sure that, so that you don't have to rely on generic information that may or may not relate to your specifics, that you have your own information. Because then that way you can show that your program, your methods are having an impact. We do have our exam next week. We're going to have chat on Monday night at 9. If anyone is interested, I will be there. It's going to cover auditory processing through this whole outcome measures discussion. So, questions about what we've covered today? Yes?
I think that the